My name is Rebecca Hayes. I'm 37, born in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where Friday nights smell like lawn clippings and someone's backyard grill. If stories about family, the kind that bruise first and heal later, mean something to you, stay. Pull up a chair beside me. And if you'd like to walk this road with me to the end, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. Quietly, like you'd leave a porch light on for a friend. This story is called Thrown Away Like Trash, Came Back Like Gold. It began on a Tuesday, one of those early dark Midwestern evenings when the sky turns the color of a bruised peach. My mother set the table like she always did, placemats she'd bought at a discount store, a roast she'd salted too much, candles she never lit. The television, always on, muttered about weather coming in from the west. My younger brother, Aaron, landed at the table to the applause of every fork. He'd made a list again, Dean's list, investor list, the endless list that kept him lit from within. You know the type. Some kids glow on their own, others are plugged into their parents' pride. I took my seat on the left, the old squeaky chair that had carried 1,000 meals and twice as many sighs. I brought a casserole I'd made from pantry scraps, beans, tomatoes, a little cumin, because you show up with something, even when what you're handing over is mostly proof you tried. Mom nodded like the dish was a polite stranger she wouldn't speak to again. Dad carved the roast like it owed him money. His hands were steady, the way men's hands get when they've taught themselves not to shake, even after a pile of layoffs and a winter of unopened bills. He didn't look at me at first. He served Aaron first and largest. He served Mom. He set the knife down. Only then did he turn his face my way. "You," he said, the word thin as a knife edge. "You're nothing but trash, get out." No slammed fist. No rising from the chair. The cruelest sentences arrive calm. Across the table, Mom lifted her glass of boxed red and smirked as if he'd just made a clever toast. The TV babbled. The heating vent rattled. Somewhere, a neighbor cut his engine and let the silence tell him he was home. I waited for the world to shout this was wrong. It didn't. There are moments in a life when every sound pulls back like a tide, and you realize you will have to decide your own worth. I set down my fork. The cheap metal ticked the plate, a tiny sound in a room that suddenly held the weight of a courthouse. "Dad," I said, just that, a single plank laid across a flood. "Don't dad me," he answered and turned his attention back to the roast like a judge who'd banged the gavel and moved to the next case. I looked to Mom. Mothers can be mercy in a house on fire. She was a matchstick. She tilted her glass. The chandelier caught the wine and lit it like a wound. "You always make things so difficult, Rebecca," she said, the vowels soft and the verdict hard. Aaron stared at his plate as if eye contact might draft him into compassion. That's the thing about favorite children. No one tells them that favoritism is a debt they'll one day have to pay back in courage. I stood. The chair complained. My hands found my coat but stopped. It felt dishonest to take anything. I left the casserole, one small kindness for a table that had none to spare for me, and I walked to the door. I wanted to say something grand, the line movie characters deliver when the soundtrack swells. All I had was breath. I opened the door and let the cold say the rest. The night hit me full in the chest. That particular Ohio cold that slips into your sleeves and decides to live there. I stepped off the porch and the porch light, on a timer, winked me goodbye. The street hummed with what I have always loved and feared about America. Life going on. A dog barked. A teenager's music thumped behind tinted glass. Somewhere, laughter. It amazed me how quickly a family can end a person and how little the world notices. I walked. Past houses that had the good sense to shut their curtains. Past the diner where my first job had taught me both humility and how to flip pancakes without breaking their hearts. Past the church with its sign, "All are welcome, Sundays at 10. I wondered if their welcome extended to daughters with nowhere to sit. By the time I reached the park, the sky had deepened to ink. I sat on a bench slick with frost and tried to hold my body small. I thought about the last time someone had said they were proud of me. I couldn't find it. Memory is strange that way. It magnifies the worst and misplaces the good like a set of keys. When you are called trash by the person who named you, your mind does an inventory. You count your mistakes like pennies. The unfinished degree when Mom got sick, and I came home for a year that lasted longer than anyone intended. The jobs that paid the rent but not the narrative. The way I always brought dessert to holidays but never enough of myself to be forgiven. Somewhere in the middle of that tally, a thought nudged me, small but insistent, like the first kick of a longed-for child. If they can throw me away, maybe I don't belong in their bin. The phrasing was crude, but the truth inside it was clean. We teach people how to treat us, yes. But first we teach ourselves. I had been teaching myself I was worth the crumbs. Maybe the lesson needed a new teacher. A wind came up, carrying the smell of damp leaves and the exhaust of a late bus. I hugged my coatless arms and closed my eyes. I pictured the dinner table, Mom's glass, Dad's knife, Aaron's hunched shoulders, and I let it dissolve. Not forever, just for the length of a breath. When I opened my eyes, the stars did that old American thing they've done for all of us when we needed them most. They kept shining. Not for me, just in spite of everything, which, when you're learning your worth again, is sometimes enough. I didn't cry. Or maybe I did and the cold took care of it. I sat there until my bones ached, and then I stood because standing is a way of telling the night you're not done. I didn't know where I'd sleep. I didn't know what tomorrow would ask. I only knew this. I would not be the thing they named me. If I was to be named again, I would choose the word myself. I started walking. Somewhere ahead, a bus would come, or a door would open, or a stranger would say my name the way it was meant to be said, without the weight of a verdict. Behind me, a porch light clicked off, right on schedule. I kept going. The first night taught me that cold has a memory. It kept returning to the same places, my wrists, the hollow of my throat, the thin spot above my collarbone, like a lesson I hadn't learned yet. I walked until the street lights thinned, and the neighborhood gave way to a strip of stores that didn't know what to do with themselves after 10 p.m. A dry cleaner asleep under plastic sheeting, a pawn shop with guitars hanging like quiet promises, a gas station that never closed. Inside the gas station, the floor was grainy with salt, and a rack of beef jerky faced down a wall of lottery tickets. The clerk was the kind of young that wears a hoodie year-round. He glanced at me, then at the door, then at me again, and said, "Coffee's fresh." It wasn't, but sometimes kindness dresses up as a lie. I counted out coins on the counter, copper and silver and a bus token I hoped he wouldn't call me on. He didn't. He slid a lid across to me and said, "You can stay a minute, it's cold." I stayed exactly the length of a coffee, the heat cupped between my palms like something alive. I used the bathroom and splashed water on my face, avoided my eyes in the mirror. The way you do when you aren't sure the person looking back has your best interest at heart. Then I went back out to where the wind made itself important. The park bench was slick with frost, but it had a back and a view of a streetlight, and both felt like luxuries. I tucked my knees up and turned my cheek into the fabric of my sleeve. Across the park, a swing set creaked to no one in particular. A train sounded miles away, the long, mournful note that pulls everything inside you into a line. I thought of my father's voice, flat and decisive, and my mother's smirk, and how humiliation loosens your bones until you feel you might slide out of yourself. I whispered my name just to see if it was still mine. By morning, the world resumed. Runners appeared with red faces and earbuds. A dog nosed my shoe and was called back by a woman in a fleece who pretended not to see me. I stood before she had to decide whether to be kind. Pride is strange, how it survives the very things designed to starve it. The diner opened at 6. I knew it. Years ago, I'd worked the griddle, learned how pancakes want heat like people want love, steady, not scorching. I walked in, hair tied back with the elastic from my wrist, and asked for work. The manager looked at my hands the way you look at a used car, checking for dents, guessing the miles. "We could use a dishwasher," he said, as if it were a verdict. "Nights, cash after shift. There are mercies that hide inside indignity. Dishwashing is one of them. No one looks at you in the dish pit unless you fall behind. You measure time in racks and steam, in the rhythm of the sprayer and the squeal of the spinner. Plates come in wearing other people's lives, ketchup constellations, the smear of pie, a lipstick print on a glass that won't let go. You strip it all away until what remains is plain and clean and ready. It felt like a metaphor even before I wanted it to. I made myself small those first days, ate the staff meals standing up by the back door, letting the heat from the kitchen crash into the cold that came in with deliveries, slept in the bus station sometimes, where the seats were molded to discourage exactly the posture I needed. Learned which security guard would leave me alone and which one was auditioning for authority he hadn't earned at home. On better nights, I found the church steps, stone that held the sun's last warmth longer than the sidewalks. I kept moving, not out of restlessness but strategy. A woman alone in the same place too many nights isn't sleeping. She's advertising. When you're reduced to essentials, the city rearranges itself. You stop seeing what stores sell and start noticing how they light their thresholds. You map water fountains, bathrooms, doors that lock. You learn the hour the library opens and the exact angle of the upstairs window where the sun lands at 10. You figure out which aisles in the drugstore have mirrors you can borrow without buying anything, which corners hold the least wind, which alley cats are allies and which ones are mean for sport. Hunger took up residence, not as a monster but as a roommate who leaves cabinets open. It made everything smaller and louder. The sizzle of bacon in the diner, the sound of an apple being bitten somewhere out of sight, the way sugar packets crackle before they pour. I ate when I could and pretended I wasn't counting when I couldn't. There is an arithmetic to survival, and it is nothing like math. It uses other people's waste and your own stubbornness and comes up with just enough. One night, late, a drunk at the counter decided I was scenery he could talk to. "You look like my sister," he said. "She left, too." I didn't ask where to was. He told me anyway, how their father had bruised the world just by standing in it, how their mother had learned to set the table for silence. "She mailed me a postcard once," he said, staring into coffee he wasn't drinking. "Said she found a place that felt like hers. I kept it. I don't know why. There are days you build yourself with your own hands, and there are days strangers hand you a piece you were missing." He left a few singles under his cup. I wiped the counter. The neon open hummed overhead like it had a secret. After my shift, I stepped into the alley and breathed the metallic air. A delivery truck idled, sending a low vibration through the dumpster and into the soles of my shoes. I pictured the dinner table again, except from a distance this time, as if the house were a snow globe I didn't live in anymore. I imagined setting it down on a shelf, not out of sight but out of reach. The image steadied me, the way placing a thing does. Little anchors appeared where I didn't expect them. The clerk at the gas station kept a styrofoam cup behind the counter with my name written crookedly in Sharpie. The librarian looked up once, assessed the situation without prying, and slid a stack of job postings across to me with a paperclip and a nod. A girl from the morning shift, barely 20 and brave in the way of people who haven't yet been taught otherwise, pressed a pair of knit gloves into my hands and said, "They're clean. My mom crochets when she worries." The gloves were navy and too big, which made them perfect. I put them on and felt the way wool holds heat as if it remembers it. I walked to the park, not the bench, a new one, and sat, Not because I had to, but because I wanted to choose something. Choice is a door that looks like a crack until you push it. I tried out words in my head like shoes I might one day be able to afford. Shelter, application, plan. Each felt a size too big. Still, I wore them around inside for a while, listened to what my steps sounded like in them. Across the path, the swing set held 2 inches of snow in each blue seat, 2 perfect hollows waiting for someone's weight. I thought about how things that look empty can be ready. By the time the horizon lightened, the thin gray that isn't quite morning but promises it, I had a plan in the loosest sense of the word. Work, save, find a room with a door that locked from the inside. I didn't know how long it would take or how many nights I'd have to outlast to get there. I only knew that I had endured the worst sentence and survived the night that followed, and that counted for something no one could see but me. I stood. The gloves made my hands look like a child's, which felt fitting. Starting over is a kind of being born again, except this time you get to name yourself. The library opened at 9, and I was there at 8:55 with the navy gloves in my pocket and the kind of hunger that books can't fix, but sometimes distract. The door clicked, and warm air spilled out with the smell of paste and paper like an old school hallway. I chose a table under a window that pretended the sun had more to give than it did. I spread out what little I owned that could pass for a plan. A notebook with a bent spiral, a pen that skipped, a bus schedule, the kind of job listings printed on paper so thin your hope shows through. I wrote down 3 headings: work, room, phone. It felt practical, adult. Somewhere between the second and third heading my hand slowed and the pen slid into a sentence it hadn't been invited to. Why didn't they want me? I stared at it until the words blurred. You can make lists all day, but sometimes the question underneath insists on its turn. Memory, when it arrives, doesn't knock. It takes the chair across from you and starts talking like an old friend who never was. I was back in our kitchen, the old yellow one before Mom painted it grage, because some magazine said it made a house look expensive. Aaron was 7, I was 12, and Dad was still okay back then, still had a voice that could turn a Saturday into a project and a project into proof that we were a family. He lined up nails like soldiers and let Aaron hold the hammer. "Steady," Dad said, his hand over my brother's, pride spilling into the room like sunlight. When it was my turn, the hammer felt too heavy. The nail bent, Dad's face pinched. "That's not how you do it, Rebecca." Not cruel, just certain. This is how stories begin to tell themselves. 1,000 small certainties laid end to end. At school, I took the lead in a play because no one else wanted to speak that many lines. The curtains smelled like dust and crayon wax. I peeked through and scanned the seats for our faces. In the second row, Mrs. Harper waved at her daughter and made a heart with her hands. Mr. Nguyen had a bouquet that kept bumping his knees. Our row remained a seam of empty. I told myself Dad's boss had kept him late, that Mom's car wouldn't start, that Aaron's game ran over. Children are generous like that. They invent weather systems that explain why the sun didn't show. Years rolled, and the pedestal grew under Aaron's feet, plank by plank. Report cards pinned to the fridge. A scream of a fastball that drew boys to the diamond and fathers to the fence. Mom learned the names of scouts the way other women learn recipes. "Your brother's going places," she said, like it was all one word, a destination stamped on a passport. My places were smaller, a poem published in a corner of the school paper, a teacher's quiet, "You have a voice, Rebecca." I kept those like winter oranges, small, bright, rationed. Then came the layoff. Restructuring, Dad called it as if the word had anything to do with building. The house changed temperature. Doors were closed louder. Laughter left like a tenant out of lease. Money argued through the vents. Mom counted coupons like prayers and measured respect in results. Aaron became the family's stock portfolio and I the cost center. It wasn't that anyone said it out loud. It was more efficient than that. It seeped. I used to think love in a family was a river you could fall into any time. But rivers have banks and currents and favored bends. Ours did. I learned to read the weather of our house. When Dad's jaw tightened, jokes were a bad investment. When Aaron lost, we all did. When Mom's eyes landed on me with that particular brand of disappointment, I'd perform a small, practiced disappearing act. Offer to do the dishes, take the longer way to my room, bring dessert and pretend it was thanks for something I hadn't received. At the library table, pen poised above paper, I let the truth say its name for once. They loved him for who he made them feel like. They tolerated me for who I refused to stop being. The sentence didn't fix anything, but it rearranged the furniture in my head. It made room for me in my own story. A toddler at the puzzle table began to whimper, the soft sound hiccuping into a cry. His mother leaned low and whispered something that made his shoulders settle. The whisper looked like love, and for a moment I envied how simple it can be when you are small and the world agrees you are worth soothing. Then I realized I was envying the wrong thing. It wasn't the whisper. It was the certainty. I turned a new page and wrote a different set of headings. What I know. What I don't. What I can do today. Under what I know, I wrote, I am not what they called me. Under what I don't, I listed, where I'll sleep next month, how to get a phone that won't be shut off, whether starting over has an age limit. Under what I can do today, I wrote, apply everywhere, save every dollar, ask for the bulletin board key to hang flyers, say yes to help without apologizing for needing it. The librarian approached with a padded envelope. This came through interbranch delivery, she said, as if I belonged to a network I hadn't met. Inside were job listings circled in green pen and a sticky note that read, morning shift at the bakery. Manager is kind. Tell her L. Sent you. No one had signed it, which made it feel less like charity and more like common sense shared among survivors. On my way out, the church sign caught me again. All are welcome. I stepped inside for the first time. The sanctuary smelled like wood polish and old hymnals. A custodian was vacuuming the aisle with the resigned patience of someone who knows carpet only looks clean for an hour at a time. He nodded. I nodded back. I sat in a back pew and let the space trick me into breathing slower. If you listen long enough in an empty church, you hear your own voice come back better. I didn't pray for my parents to change. I didn't pray for Aaron to see me. I prayed for appetite, for the will to keep showing up for a life that hadn't shown up for me yet. It felt like ordering breakfast before you're truly hungry, trusting the smell of coffee to wake the body it's headed toward. Back outside, the day had edged itself fuller. A school bus sighed to a stop. Kids spilled out like marbles and scattered toward different doors. I headed to the bakery with the sticky note in my pocket, the gloves back on my hands, and a question reshaped into something useful. Not why didn't they want me, but what do I want now that I'm free to ask? The difference was small and everything. Halfway down the block, I passed the old house that had become a snow globe in my mind. The porch looked smaller in daylight. The curtains were open. The television flickered. I didn't slow down. Some returns are detours you can't afford. I kept walking toward the smell of sugar and yeast, toward warm air and a bell that might ring when someone like me opened the door. The bell above the bakery door gave a bright little ring, the kind that feels like a compliment. Warm air rolled over me, yeast, cinnamon, a whisper of vanilla, and my body reacted before my mind could, letting go of a shiver it had been holding for days. Behind the counter, trays of morning had been arranged like a promise. Croissants stacked into little mountains, muffins domed and sugared, a braid of challah so glossy it seemed lit from inside. A woman in a flour-dusted apron looked up from the register. She had kind eyes and the posture of someone who'd learned to carry more than her share without making a speech about it. "You must be Rebecca," she said, tapping the sticky note I'd pulled from my pocket. The green ink had bled a little, as if the letters had perspired on their way across town. "I'm Mrs. Patel. Elle said you might come by." I nodded, suddenly aware of my hair, my shoes, the way my coat didn't close quite right. "I can work," I said, and meant it as a thesis. She studied me the way good people do, without turning it into a mirror. "We start early," she said. 3 a.m. Most folks don't believe in mornings until the smell of bread gives them religion. A smile, quick and dry. "Can you be here tomorrow?" "Yes." The word felt like a jump I'd already made. She handed me a white apron and a paper hat that would fit no one without protest. "Let's not wait. You can start today. Help in the back, then watch the counter. We'll see how it feels." The back of the bakery was its own weather system. The air was wet and warm. Machines thumped in a rhythm that could have been a heartbeat if hearts were industrial. 2 young men worked side by side with the ease of people who have learned each other's steps. One sprinkled flour like snowfall. The other turned dough as if coaxing a shy idea into speaking. "Dough hooks scare people," Mrs. Patel said, guiding me past a mixer big enough to hide in. "They look like they might grab something you can't replace. They won't. They just do their job." She showed me the bins, flour, sugar, salt, the scoops resting on top like little oars. "Baking is exact and forgiving at once," she said, and I thought of how rarely those 2 things lived in the same sentence. She set me to work on simple things. Lining trays, brushing egg wash, counting by 6s into boxes that would find their way into offices where no one knew me. When I brushed the tops of the rolls, each golden arc felt ceremonial, like painting a small sun onto something willing to rise. Between batches, I helped at the counter. People filed in with the needs mornings create. Caffeine, sweetness, a reason to smile at something other than a screen. A man in a neon vest bought a cinnamon roll and tore it in half without leaving the doorway, tucking one piece into his pocket like a secret he wanted later. A girl with a backpack chose a blueberry muffin and counted change with the focus of the newly responsible. A nurse with fatigue written all over her scrub top ordered a dozen assorted and said, "The night shift is mean without sugar," the way you might explain a war. When the line thinned, Mrs. Patel slid a tray of slightly misshapen cookies toward me. "We call these family," she said. "Not pretty enough to sell, too good to throw away." She pushed 2 into a wax bag and waited until I took them. They were still warm, the chocolate chips soft enough to stain my fingers. "Thank you," I said, and meant more than the cookies. She wiped her hands on her apron and tilted her head. "You have somewhere to be tonight." The question reached for me gently but didn't force an answer. I met it halfway. "Working the diner, nights." She nodded. "Then you have 2 families now, diners at night, bakers in the morning. Between them, we feed a city and a few souls." She glanced at the wall clock. "You'll need sleep like a job." I smiled at that, at the idea that rest could be earned like a paycheck. When my shift ended, she paid me in cash, bills folded around a small card with the bakery's name and a number. On the back, her handwriting curved in blue ink, "If you're late, call. If you can't come, call. If you need help, ask." Under the words, she drew a tiny loaf, steam lines rising like prayer. Out on the sidewalk, the day had the kind of brightness that comes without warmth. I tucked the card into my pocket and walked toward the bus station, where I could sit without buying anything if I looked like I was waiting for something. On the way, I passed the community center, a low brick building with a bulletin board outside. A paper hung slightly crooked. Adult ed and night classes, JED Computer Basics Scholarship Info 2s and 3s, 7 p.m. I stood there longer than a person needs to read a poster. A gust lifted the corner and let it fall. Classes aren't magic, but they are a door, and I had just remembered how to knock. I showed up at 7, smelling faintly of vanilla and cleaning chemicals, with sleep tucked somewhere I couldn't reach. The classroom was full of the brave, people who had worked all day and decided to work some more. A woman in a hotel uniform traced letters in a workbook as if they might cut her. A man in steel-toe boots tackled fractions with both elbows on the table, his face set in a line that said today, this. A veteran wore a sweatshirt that made room for his shoulders and a gaze that took in every exit without meaning to. The instructor was thin and cheerful in the way of people who don't confuse volume with encouragement. She wrote welcome back on the board and underlined it once. Not welcome, she said, tapping the word. Welcome back, because you've been here before, maybe not in this room, but in the part of your life that reaches for something. When she handed out forms, I learned that pens can weigh different amounts depending on what you're writing. Name, address, phone. I wrote the bakery's number for the emergency contact because Mrs. Patel had given me permission to, and because if a person offers you a bridge, you step onto it even if you don't like heights. Halfway through, the door opened and a man slipped in with librarian quiet. He carried a stack of pamphlets against his chest and left them on a side table. White hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a face I knew the way you know a song from the first chord. Professor Ellis. The name left me before I could decide whether to keep it. He turned, searching the room like a person who has been called from a distance. His eyes landed on me, recognition softened the lines around them. Rebecca Hayes. He said my name like a sentence with hope at the end. It had been years, community college, a literature class I took because the brochure promised stories and air conditioning. He'd been the kind of teacher who read a line out loud and let silence be the second paragraph. Once, he'd written in the margin of my essay, "You see people clearly. Don't stop just because they don't see you back." I had kept that paper in a drawer until drawers were a luxury. Now he stepped closer, not too close. "You look like you kept going," he said, choosing words minors use when they find a vein they suspected but had never seen. "I'm trying," I answered. It felt less like a confession than a pledge. After class, he waited near the pamphlets as if that had been the purpose of his visit all along. "We have a small scholarship fund," he said, not making a spectacle of it. "For people who left school to take care of other things and then decided those things didn't have to be the end of their education. It's not much, but it's more than nothing. More than nothing." That was a remarkable phrase, I thought. It described so many bridges I'd been offered lately, coffee that wasn't fresh, gloves that were too big, a note from a stranger named L, a loaf drawn in blue ink. I took the pamphlet. It listed process and deadlines, the concrete nouns that make hope behave. Back at the bus station, I sat under the arrivals board and read every line like it was a chapter. The words tilted and straightened as I blinked. I hadn't eaten since a roll at dawn. My stomach made its case. I thought of the family cookies and decided to save the second one for morning. Small acts of kindness should not be consumed all at once. When the bus hissed to a stop, I boarded and let it carry me through a city that, despite everything, kept offering me rooms I might one day move into. Street by street, the night remade itself into a place I could belong to. It didn't love me. It didn't have to. It tolerated me in a way that felt like the beginning of something sturdier. At the diner, the manager handed me a stack of plates and pointed toward the back. "You're a machine," he said, meaning it as praise. I thought of the mixer at the bakery, that huge metal bowl and its certain hook. Machines aren't heartless, they are consistent. I could be that. For now, consistency was a kind of love I could trust. Hours later, steam rinsed the last plate of the night. I hung the apron, counted my cash, and tucked 2 bills into a separate pocket, the pocket I didn't touch unless a thing had the word future stamped on it. Outside, the wind had settled. The stars were doing their unremarkable miracle. On the way to the church steps, I passed the community center again. The poster flapped once, then lay still. I touched the corner to smooth it like a person tucking in a child. Tuesday, I told it and myself. I'll be back. The scholarship form looked like a map of a country I had left a long time ago, boxes to be filled, lines that wanted answers I didn't yet have. I spread it across a library table and smoothed its creases with the flat of my palm like calming a skittish animal. Name, address. I wrote the church's cross street for now, close enough to find me if someone cared to try. Employment. I put bakery morning, diner night, and felt for the first time in a while like a sentence with a subject and two verbs. The essay prompt was small and blunt. Describe a moment when you chose to keep going. I stared at those 6 words until the clock over the reference desk clicked me into honesty. I did not write about noble decisions or grand declarations. I wrote about a park bench and a cup of gas station coffee, the weight of a bus token passed, as if it were currency the world still recognized. I wrote about the casseroles you bring to families who never bring one back, and the way a daughter learns to move like a ghost so as not to disturb the living. I wrote about hearing the word trash in my father's mouth and choosing to believe that definition did not have to be permanent. I wrote it plain and true, the way Mrs. Patel salts her loaves, not enough to call attention to itself, just enough to make everything else taste like what it is. Professor Ellis read it at a corner table under a lamp that hummed. He didn't touch his tea, and when he finished, he didn't offer edits that would make it prettier. He slid the pages back to me with the softest push. "This is a person talking," he said. "People listen to that." I mailed the packet with the carefulness of someone sending a fragile part of herself to an address with no guarantees. The envelope slid into the blue mailbox with a sound like a door closing in a house that doesn't belong to you anymore. Then I walked back to the bakery and put my hands in dough. Days fell into a rhythm that made a kind of music if you listened from the right distance. Mornings at the bakery, the early dark, the lights snapping on Mrs. Patel humming something old and soothing while we braided sweetness out of flour. Midday at the library, forms, job boards, the sight of strangers learning to trust their own names. Late afternoons under the church eaves with my navy gloves turned inside out to dry. Nights at the diner, the dish pit's steam, the symphony of plates and cutlery returning from other people's dinners, the comfort of work that asked nothing of me but everything I had. The community center became my Tuesday and Thursday promise. Fractions gave up their small grudges against me. I learned the difference between upload and download, the way a tab can open a room you couldn't afford to knock on before. A woman named Cora with a name tag that said volunteer and a laugh that said professional survivor taught me to build a resume that didn't apologize. "Put the bakery first," she said, tapping the printout. "People like hiring those who rise while the city sleeps." On a Thursday that smelled like rain and burnt toast, Mrs. Patel set a brown paper bag on the counter and pushed it toward me. Inside, tucked between a loaf with a blistered crust and a clamshell of day-old pastries, was a cheap flip phone and a prepaid card. "We have a lost and found," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Sometimes things remain lost. Sometimes they find a person. Either way, a phone is a tool." "I can't," I began. "You can," she said. "You'll need a number to put on applications and to call if you're going to be late." She smiled without making it a performance, "and to answer when good news tries to find you." I bought a second-hand purse at the thrift store and tucked the phone inside, along with a pen that didn't skip and a handful of mints from the diner jar. The purse made me feel like a person in motion rather than a person adrift. It held things. So did I. Good news arrived in an envelope that felt heavier than paper should. The return address had the scholarship fund's name printed in sober font, like a parent signing something important. I took it to the back pew at the church because some news asks for a witness. The letter began with one word that is both a mercy and an obligation. Congratulations. I read it twice, then a third time slower, the way you reintroduce yourself to a feeling you thought had left town for good. We are pleased to award you tuition assistance for the coming term. Book stipend, advisor assignment. The phrases were a bridge laid board by board. At the bottom, in blue ink, a note looking forward to seeing what you build are. E, the initial was enough. Professor Ellis had slipped my hope into a system and taught it how to walk on its own. At the bakery, Mrs. Patel hugged me the way people who have lived through winter's hug, brief but warming. She moved my schedule around without making me feel like a burden. We'll get you to class and back, she said. Bread rises without watching, but people don't. The diner gave me a second pair of non-slip shoes and a lift to a bus stop that shaved 12 minutes off the cold. The manager grunted, "Don't make a thing of it, which is Midwestern for we're proud of you." I bought a spiral notebook that hadn't belonged to anyone else first and a set of highlighters that looked like Easter. I rented a room the size of a generous closet above a nail salon from a widow who treated the hall like a parlor and the tenants like cousins. The room had a window that looked directly into a maple tree, and on windy days the branches tapped like a polite friend. The radiator hissed and clanged, but I learned its schedule and came to like its temper. There was a lock on the door that turned from the inside with a sound I believed I might one day recognize as safety. Classes began in a building that smelled like chalk and vending machine oranges. I sat in the third row because the front felt like boasting and the back felt like retreat. Professor Ellis taught one of the seminars. He asked questions that weren't traps and waited long enough for answers that weren't rehearsed. He brought in stories like travelers and let them leave with fewer secrets. Balancing everything was less like juggling and more like apprenticing for a clockmaker. Each gear had to know its burden and its timing. Bakery at 3, class at 9, library at noon, community center at 7, diner at 9. I slept in small, deliberate pieces and ate what kindness and coupons could provide. Some days the math worked. Some days I paid the deficit with stubbornness. On nights the ledger bled too much, I took out the letter that began with congratulations and read it like a prayer. There were stumbles. A bus broke down and I missed a quiz worth more than a person should have to prove in 20 minutes. I cried in a bathroom stall with graffiti that said you've survived 100% of your worst days in a handwriting that had clawed its way toward hope. Mrs. Patel pressed an orange into my palm and said, "Peel it slow. Make it last." A classmate named Javier shared his notes without making it look like charity. "We all draft off somebody," he said, referencing cycling or life. One afternoon, the dean's office sent an email with my name in the subject line, which in my life had been a prelude to accusation more often than celebration. I opened it ready to brace. "We are pleased to inform you academic excellence list." The sentences that followed were formal, but I could hear a human behind them, the way you hear a person behind a recording if you've been alone long enough. I didn't forward it to anyone. I read it, and then I stood by the window and told the maple tree like it needed to know. On a rainy Tuesday, the bakery's front bell rang, and in walked a woman I recognized immediately by the tilt of her chin. Mothers have a way of teaching their daughters the geometry of their faces, even when they don't mean to. She did not scan the case or the menu, she scanned me. For a second, the room fell away and I was back at a table where roast cooled and silence heated. Then the present reasserted itself. Flour on my cuffs, warmth in the air, Mrs. Patel a steady presence to my right. "Rebecca," my mother said, testing whether my name still fit in her mouth. "Hello, Mom." The word surprised us both by how gently it landed. She asked for a loaf, the kind she used to buy for holidays. Her hand trembled an imperceptible amount when she reached for her wallet. I bagged the bread and set it on the counter. She didn't mention that evening, and I didn't ask her to. We weren't ready. Some conversations are like bread. You rush them and they collapse. When she left, Mrs. Patel didn't pry. She slid me a glass of water and a look that said both I saw and I'll wait. I drank, counted to 10, breathed the way the community center instructor had taught us to, when panic tried to rent a room in the chest. That night in class, Professor Ellis read a line aloud about forgiveness being a kind of economy. There is what you owe, and there is what you can pay, he said. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is balance the books in a different currency. I wrote it down, underlined it, and circled it until the page looked like a target I refused to miss again. By the time the maple leaves had turned the color of burnt sugar, I could feel the ground under me. Not the whole ground, enough for a person to stand. I had a number that rang to my pocket, a lock that turned from the inside, work that traded sweat for money instead of dignity for silence, a seat in a classroom where my name was called without malice. And somewhere inside that steadiness, a new thought made itself known, tentative as a fawn stepping from the tree line. Maybe I'm not just surviving their story. Maybe I'm writing mine. The semester tightened its grip the way winter does, quietly, then all at once. Assignments multiplied, deadlines lined up like traffic cones. At the bakery, dawn came earlier because we asked it to. At the diner, midnight clung a few minutes past closing. I carried a backpack everywhere, a portable life, notebooks, a change of socks, a roll of quarters for laundry, a granola bar I kept forgetting I'd already promised myself. In Professor Ellis's seminar, we read about ordinary people performing extraordinary repairs on their own lives. I loved those stories the way you love photographs of places you plan to visit. They made me patient with the plodding work of it. Bus after bus, class after class, one page, one clean plate, one shift more. Some days I felt like a bead on a string. I didn't move the necklace, but I kept it from breaking. Javier and I fell into an easy alliance born from repetition. We weren't friends in the way people with leisure are friends. We were co-conspirators against quitting. He worked afternoons at a warehouse where everything arrived on pallets and left as inventory you could find with a barcode and a plan. It's weird, he said one day as we compared schedules, how the world comes in broken and leaves sorted. He said it casually, but the sentence hung around like a mentor. Our capstone project asked us to fix something small and real, not just write about the people who did. Pick a problem that doesn't know your name yet, Ellis said, and introduce yourself kindly. The city had just announced a pilot for reducing landfill waste in 3 neighborhoods, the kind of initiative that makes the morning news and then disappears into meetings. I chose it because I knew what it felt like to be thrown away, and because turning trash into something useful had become both metaphor and muscle. The plan was humble. Partner with the community center, teach a series of free workshops on sorting, composting, and upcycling basic household items. Make kits from donated bins, labels, and a starter bag of composting material. Incentivize with bakery vouchers, Mrs. Patel insisted on adding those, and a raffle for a month of free bus passes funded by the scholarship's tiny community grant line item. I printed flyers on the library's laser printer and cut the edges straight with a borrowed trimmer, because if you are asking strangers to care, the least you can do is offer them a straight edge. The first workshop drew 8 people, which felt like a failure until I learned to count correctly. 8 people is a table, a conversation that can hear itself. A grandmother with a grocery cart asked if coffee grounds were trash or treasure. A teenage boy wanted to know whether his landlord could evict him for keeping a compost bin on a fire escape. A mother of 3 brought her children, and a skepticism that softened into curiosity when the kids got to stick their hands in soil and see that it was alive. I built slides with pictures instead of paragraphs, because pictures arrive to the brain like friends who don't need introductions. Javier rigged a scale from a luggage hook and a milk crate so we could weigh what we diverted. We tracked pounds saved from the landfill on a poster by the door. The black Sharpie tally marks started to look like Hope wearing work clothes. Word spread the way news travels in places that still talk to themselves, slowly, then everywhere. The second workshop filled the room. The third spilled into the hallway. The community center director found a bigger space, and I handed out sign-in sheets like a person counting blessings out loud. Local news called and sent a camera that made everything it aimed at look briefly more important. I watched myself on a diner TV while filling salt shakers, and tried not to flinch at the sound of my voice doing what I'd once thought it couldn't: explain, invite, with no apology threaded through. Mrs. Patel became logistics captain without seeking the title. She kept a bin behind the counter labeled Rebecca's Kits, tucking in rolls of labels, a Sharpie, and the vouchers she wrote out by hand when the printer jammed. "People think bread is flour and water," she said, stamping a date onto a bag. "They forget about the salt, the small thing that makes everything honest." She meant the vouchers, the way a person means the thing and everything next to it. On campus, I met with an advisor assigned by the scholarship, a woman with neat handwriting and a desk plant that looked like it had opinions. She mapped requirements and electives into a sequence that didn't steal hours I couldn't spare. "You're building something while you're building something," she said, drawing 2 tracks that gradually slid toward each other. "Don't let anyone pretend one doesn't count." At night, I brought my progress notes to the diner and read them on breaks, the laminated menus under my elbows reflecting back a version of me I was still getting used to. A person with a project, a person using verbs that moved. The manager noticed without comment, which is his language for approval. He shifted my closing nights so they didn't collide with workshop evenings, then feigned ignorance when I thanked him. Inventory was better on Wednesdays anyway, he said, lying for the sake of dignity. Winter loosened its grip, and the maples outside my window returned to their summer selves with the kind of forgiveness I envy. The capstone required a final presentation. I reserved the community center auditorium because I wanted the room to see what it had made. People arrived carrying their own proof: photos of balcony composters, a mason jar of dark, rich soil passed from hand to hand like a newborn, a sketch from the teenage boy of a better bin system for buildings like his that wouldn't get anyone fined. We weighed another week's worth of diverted waste and cheered the number like a game-winning shot. It wasn't a movement, it was a neighborhood behaving like one. Professor Ellis stood in the back, the posture of a man allowing a moment to be mine. When I finished, he didn't clap louder than anyone else. He clapped exactly as he should, then waited for the questions to stop and the crowd to thin. "You didn't fix the city," he said, eyes amused. "You fixed some corners. Corners are where rooms begin." I sent in the formal report with graphs and modest language, the way women are taught to apologize inside their competence and then forget at the last minute. The city emailed back with an invitation to a meeting I expected to be ceremonial. It wasn't. Around a long table sat 3 people who had already read my pages, and one who asked the kind of questions that prove she knows both budgets and impatience. "We'd like to expand this pilot," she said. "Would you consider a contract position to coordinate the rollout?" Contract position, coordinate, rollout. The words stacked like bricks I wanted to stand on, surprised by their own weight. "Yes," I said, because some questions don't need courtship. When the meeting ended, I walked outside into air that couldn't decide between rain and light, and I cried the way people cry when a pressure valve is finally located, then turned. Success didn't arrive with champagne. It arrived as paperwork and a badge that opened a door in a building I'd previously walked past without noticing. I spent mornings at the city office with a hand-me-down laptop and a calendar full of neighborhoods. Afternoons at the bakery were replaced by spreadsheets, which sounds like a demotion until you realize the spreadsheets are about feeding a different kind of hunger. I still took the early bus sometimes out of habit, and Mrs. Patel still kept a coffee for me that cooled on mornings I didn't make it. "You're allowed to grow," she said, wrapping a loaf for a customer who wanted the usual in a world that wasn't offering much of it. The room above the nail salon began to look like a person lived there. Books stacked in small cities, a plant that refused to die, a cheap rug that tricked the eye into pretending the floor was warmer. I found a second-hand desk someone had abandoned curbside and carried it up 2 flights in 3 trips. I sanded a corner smooth and set my flip phone beside a pen that now wrote without coaxing. On the wall, I taped a printout of the landfill pounds diverted, the number rising in the erratic but steady way of a heart monitor on a patient you are learning to trust will live. I didn't tell my parents, not out of spite, out of respect for the quiet that was still teaching me how to listen. I saw Aaron once, from across a street near the old house, his stride threaded with the confidence of a man who had rarely been asked to inventory the costs of being loved first and best. I didn't cross. Blessing from a distance is a skill I'm not sure I asked for, but I'm grateful to be learning. One evening, as I was locking the community center door after a late meeting, a small voice called from the sidewalk. The teenage boy, the one who'd drawn the better bin, jogged up with a folded paper. "They're letting me present this to my building manager," he said, trying to sound casual and failing. "I put your name on it, like as a reference." He looked at his shoes. "If that's okay." "It is," I said. "It's more than okay." I unfolded the paper and saw a clean diagram, measurements, a budget scrawled in tidy numbers. The title said a system that works where I live. It was the kind of sentence I hadn't known I was waiting my whole life to read. On the bus ride home, city lights flickered past like chapters. I thought about systems that work and those that don't, and how often people get sorted the way trash does, useful or not, wanted or not, kept or cast out. My work didn't fix that. It turned toward it, which is step 1 of every repair worth making. I pressed my palm against the glass and felt the rumble of forward motion. The window held the faint outline of my face, a woman with flour in the seams of her fingerprints and ink on the pads, a woman who knows the exact weight of a clean plate and the exact tone of an email that changes a life. Back in my room, the radiator hissed its familiar sigh. I hung my coat, set my bag on the desk, and faced the printout with the rising number. I added today's pounds in a neat hand, then drew a small star in the margin. Not for the number, for the boy's blueprint, for corners becoming rooms, for a city nudging itself toward better. I turned off the light and paused at the window. The maple outside lifted its leaves in the breeze like a congregation at the end of a hymn. Somewhere in the distance, a train sent its long note across the dark, a reminder that departures and arrivals share the same track. I lay down, pulled the blanket to my chin, and let sleep come not as an escape, but as a worker changing shifts with me, reliable on time, ready to carry what I could set down for a few hours. Tomorrow would ask for more. I was learning how to answer. The contract came with a badge that clicked against my chest when I walked, and a calendar that filled itself if I looked away. Mornings were neighborhoods I'd only ever passed through, now opening doors so we could talk about banana peels and broken chairs like they were decisions. Afternoons were spreadsheets that made a case in numbers for what the eye could see. Less in the dumpsters, more in the soil, people who'd stopped apologizing for caring where things went. I kept a running tally on the wall above my desk. Pounds diverted, sessions taught, volunteers trained, not to brag, but to remember that progress is shy. It needs coaxing and evidence. Javier became my right hand without a ceremony. He could take a room that was half interested and turn it toward yes with a prop and a joke. He built a demo composter out of a plastic tote and a handful of red wigglers. The kids named the worms and started bringing vegetable scraps like offerings. Mrs. Patel started labeling a basket at the front of the bakery for the compost, and people began dropping egg cartons and coffee grounds like they'd been waiting to be told how to be useful. On Thursdays, I still went to class, the kind where you don't get a certificate for learning how to breathe through bad news. Professor Ellis carried himself like a man who'd seen storms and learned not to yell at them. He asked questions that made you reveal your own answers. Once, after I'd presented our third-quarter data to a city subcommittee without my voice doing that tremble it used to love, he said simply, "You're becoming the person your work would hire." I wrote it down and let the sentence follow me for days like a good shadow. Recognition, when it finally arrived, didn't look like a parade. It looked like a folding chair at a neighborhood council meeting, saved with a sticky note that said Rebecca, like a flyer I hadn't designed being taped in a laundromat window, like a message left on my flip phone from a local radio host. "We'd love to have you on for 5 minutes about the pilot." 5 minutes turned into 10 because callers kept calling, and I explained what we were doing in words my father would have understood if he'd ever wanted to. When I hung up, my hands shook, not from fear, but from the relief of saying a thing plainly into a world that, for once, didn't argue. The room above the nail salon softened around me. I bought a second-hand coat that knew winter better than I did, and a pair of boots that made slush sulk. The widow downstairs started leaving a piece of mail on the hall table with a paperweight on top, for 3B in ink heavy enough to count as concern. Once she added a note, "The radiator will kick at 2 a.m. Don't be afraid, it's only remembering." I pinned it to the corkboard next to the rising number and the boys' bin sketch. My mother came in again, 3 weeks after her first visit, at the tail end of a morning rush, when the cases looked like a snowfall had come through and taken only the best. She stood off to the side and waited in a way that told me she remembered what it meant to be polite without knowing how to be around me. When I reached the register, she asked for 2 loaves and a dozen rolls, the kind that used to sit in a basket on our table at Thanksgiving, absorbing gravy and apologies. "How are you?" she asked, like the phrase might break in her mouth if she put too much weight on it. "I'm well," I said. It was mostly true. "Busy, working." She nodded, but her eyes darted past me, taking in the trays, the bell, the way Mrs. Patel moved like a quiet commandment behind the counter. "I saw you," she said. "On the radio." Well, Aaron played the clip on his phone. The sentence made itself ridiculous and then forgivable in the space of a breath. "You sounded." She searched for a word and chose one we never used at home. "Sure." I bagged the rolls and set them down. I wanted to ask about the house, about Dad's jaw and the bills, and whether the silence at the table had learned any new shapes. I wanted to say you threw me away. I wanted to say I am fine. I did neither. Instead, I said, "If you ever need information about the city's home repair grants or utility assistance, the community center has a counselor on Tuesdays. They're kind." It was not an offer of money or absolution. It was a bridge most people can walk. She took the bag with both hands. "You're doing something good," she said, as if the fact of it surprised her but the value did not. After she left, Mrs. Patel pressed a glass of water into my hand and leaned on the counter beside me, just enough to say steady. Daughters and mothers, she said, eyes on the door, are languages nobody ever becomes fluent in. I slept that afternoon like a person who had finally learned how to close both eyes. When I woke, there was a voicemail on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice, careful. "Rebecca, this is Tom, your father's friend from the plant. He had a episode. He's okay. They've kept him at Riverside for observation." The word episode did the work of a whole paragraph: anger, pride, a heart that had been living on a diet of shoulds. I sat at the small desk and put my head in my hands. Memory pulled me toward the door. Wisdom asked me to sit. I didn't go that night. I went in the morning when the hospital lobby smelled like lemon and luck. The elevators spoke in numbers. A nurse at the desk told me room 304 and gave me the map smile. The one that says you're almost there, even if you aren't. I stood in the doorway and took in the man who had once lifted me onto his shoulders to see fireworks and later could not see me when I was seated 5 feet away. He looked smaller in the hospital way, as if the bed stole volume and left outlines. His eyes found me after a second. Something like relief crossed his face, then left, embarrassed to have made itself visible. "If you're here to scold me," he said, voice papery, "you'll have to wait until I can sit up without the room arguing." "I'm not here to scold you," I said, and pulled the chair closer. "I'm here to visit." We sat with the hum of machines doing their measurable kindness. On the TV in the corner, a morning show discussed a recipe as if it were a moral. He cleared his throat. "Your mother said you're on the radio." "I talk about trash," I said. "And what isn't?" His mouth twitched in a way that used to be a smile. Always did have a way with whatever this is. He gestured at the space between us, a comedian bombing his way through an apology. I could have rehearsed my pain in full. I knew all the lines. Instead, I asked how he was sleeping, whether the food was edible, whether anyone had explained the new pills in a language that didn't require a medical degree. He answered like a man who'd forgotten how to be asked. When he paused, reaching for words, I watched his hand, not the one that had pointed toward the door once, but the one that had steadied a bicycle seat when I thought I would tip. Before I left, I set a small stack of bakery vouchers on the tray beside the water cup. "For the nurses," I said. "They'll share. It tends to improve whatever room they walk into." He didn't pick them up. He looked at them like you look at a thing you haven't earned. "Thank you," he said eventually, and the words sounded like an admission that there were other words he couldn't get to yet. Back at the office, the day asked me to be competent, and I obliged. There were emails to answer, a pilot to expand, a meeting with a landlord who thought green meant cost and pilot meant inconvenience. I brought the numbers, the kit, the story about the grandmother and her coffee grounds. He didn't lean forward the way people do when they are changing their mind. He leaned back, which is sometimes the same thing in men who have taught their bodies to hide their consent. "Fine," he said. "Try it in Building B. It is a tiny victory to anyone else. To me, it was a corridor opening without my shoulder against it." That evening, as we packed up after a workshop, the teenage boy, Evan, he had told me, like a name my mouth had always had room for, came over and handed me a folded paper. It was a permission slip with a signature at the bottom in a cramped, careful hand. "Manager approves pilot bin system for 4th floor landing." He pointed at the name. "She said it was because I had a reference who made sense. That's you." Then he said a thing I wasn't prepared to hear from a kid whose knees were still figuring out their own height. "Thanks for not making me feel dumb when I didn't know what to call the bins. Thanks for making a system that works where you live," I said, and meant it the way you mean good job and keep going and I see you all at once. On the bus home, the city slid by like a film that had been poorly edited and was somehow better for it. I pressed my forehead to the cool window and let the day replay, not in order but in truth. A mother at a counter, a father in a bed, a boy with a blueprint, a landlord saying fine, a teacher's sentence following me like a benediction. Back in my room, I added another tally to the wall. Pounds diverted, yes, but also something I couldn't quantify with a Sharpie. The moment a voice stops shaking when it says its own name. The radiator hissed. The maple rustled. I took out the letter that had begun with congratulations and slipped it beneath the growing stack of proof that I was, in fact, becoming. Then I turned off the light and lay there listening to the building breathe, to the city breathe, to myself. There is a point in every repair when the thing being fixed begins to hold its own weight again. Screws turn less out of duty and more out of rightness. Hinges stop complaining. Doors open and close like they were designed to. Lying there, eyes open in the almost dark, I felt something inside me shift from welded to whole. Tomorrow would come with its list. I had my pencil sharpened. The email subject line read like a dare. City Pilot Extension, Year 2 Proposal. I opened it at the desk that still smelled faintly of nail polish remover from the salon below, half expecting a polite decline wrapped in bureaucratic words. Instead, there was an invitation I hadn't prepared my mouth to say out loud. A request to design the next phase. More buildings, more blocks, real budget, real responsibility. Attached at the bottom, like a footnote with power, was a line about encouraging outside partnerships to sustain the program beyond municipal funding. Sustain. Beyond. The words folded themselves into a shape I recognized only from distance. I printed the email and walked it to the bakery because some news needs to pass through warmth before it becomes true. Mrs. Patel read it, wiped a dot of flour from the corner, and slid it back to me with a nod that did not overcomplicate the moment. "You're going to need a bigger bowl," she said. Javier and I sat at the community center that afternoon with a legal pad and 2 coffees that had already fallen out of their best hour. "Do we build this inside the city?" he asked. "Or do we build something that can outlast elections?" Elections. The word did arithmetic on our budget that no spreadsheet had solved. We built a list we called What This Is. Really. Neighbors learning each other's names over bins. Kids choosing worms over screens for 10 minutes. Landlords converting skepticism into compliance. Pounds diverted into soil, and then tomatoes. People who'd been told they were too small making dents in a problem everyone agreed was too big. Then we wrote the thing you're not supposed to write unless you're willing to wake up early for it. A company. Not a sleek, world-eating thing. Something built for the size of the rooms we knew. Part service, part software, part stubbornness. Naming it felt like asking a child who they wanted to be. We tried on words that were already taken by companies with shiny websites. In the end, we chose something plain and honest. Second turn. It sounded like what we did, what the city was learning to do, what I had done with my life when the first pass tossed me aside. We sketched a logo on a napkin, an arrow curling back not in defeat but in intention. Building anything official requires forms that pretend to know you. We filed for an LLC at a public terminal in the library, where the time limit bar at the top of the screen scrolled down like a countdown in an action movie. A volunteer at the center connected us to a small business clinic that met in a classroom with wobbling chairs and a whiteboard full of acronyms. A woman in a thrift store blazer explained terms like fiscal sponsor and pilot customer in English, then said the sentence that shifted the ground. "Separate your work from your wage. The city is your present. Your company is your future." Funding did not fall from a sky. It showed up as a micro grant from a local foundation, with a mission statement that sounded like a hand extended. As a check from the neighborhood council, whose meetings we'd stopped by even when the agenda was potholes. As a letter from a grocery chain promising to save their coffee grounds if we'd pick them up on Thursdays. Mrs. Patel brought a tin box from the back labeled tips and dumped half into an envelope with our new name written on it. "Bread rises best," she said, "when you start with a starter someone cared for." We rented a corner of a warehouse a bus ride away, the kind of space where ideas like to echo. The landlord, a man who'd made peace with dust, asked what kind of business we were. "We pick up what people think they're done with," I said. "We give it a second turn." He nodded like he understood more than I'd said, and cut the rent by a number that meant he wanted us there. Javier designed routes on grid paper first. Then in a free mapping tool he swore was good enough until it isn't. I built a calendar that held pickups, workshops, and the new city meetings where my badge let me through a door I still held for strangers. We hired 2 part-time drivers who knew every alley like family and could chat a compost bin into compliance. We trained volunteers to be evangelists without becoming scolds. We wrote scripts for awkward conversations at dumpsters and practiced them out loud until they sounded like neighbors. Our first week, we missed a pickup window at a building where the superintendent wore a baseball cap that had never understood a grin. He met us on the sidewalk with crossed arms and the air of a man who enjoyed being correct. I apologized before he could wield it. "We're here now," I said. "We'll make it right." We hauled double and left the landing cleaner than we found it. The next Tuesday he texted at 5:59 a.m. "FYI, cart is full. Coffee in the lobby. Compliance has a temperature. It's warmer than shame." We built a simple reporting tool, a glorified spreadsheet with a prettier face, that let buildings see their diversion in real time. Numbers are shy, yes, but pride is loud. Managers started sending screenshots to their tenants with captions that said, "Look what we did this month," and the replies came back with emojis that, while not scientific, seemed like data we should count. A local paper ran a profile with a photo of me standing in front of a stack of labeled bins, my hair escaping an elastic and my coat patched at the elbow. The headline was earnest and corny in a way that works on Thursdays, turning trash into gold. People brought it into the bakery, folded to my face. "Mrs. Patel taped a copy near the register and circled the part where I said, 'It isn't magic, it's neighbors.' She added in Sharpie and bread. We outgrew the flip phone. The city gave me a smartphone with an email address that ended in Gov, which made vendors return calls in hours instead of days. I kept the flip phone in a drawer like a relic. Sometimes I opened it to remind myself what beginnings weigh. We bought a used van that smelled like oranges and old rope, and Javier insisted we wrap it with our logo even if the vinyl peeled at the corners. When kids saw it parked outside their building, they pointed and shouted, "Second turn," like it was an ice cream truck for worms. Success is not a straight line, it's a braid. The morning the radio host invited me back for an update, the van refused to start and I learned, right there, that jumper cables can be a sacrament. The week a councilwoman praised our metrics in a meeting, a raccoon family staged a midnight buffet in one of our outdoor bins, and we had to redesign lids with latches persuasive enough to convince even the determined hungry. We made mistakes, wrote them down, and called the list tuition. One evening, after a presentation that did not embarrass either of us, Javier and I stood outside the community center under a sky that had decided to keep its stars to itself. "This is a company," he said, not looking at me, "not just a project." He said it like people say home the first time the word fits the space they're living in. I told my father with a postcard because hospital conversations had taught me that words can arrive gentler in handwriting. On the front was a photo of a city compost pile turning itself back into earth. On the back I wrote, "I started something." It picks up what people are done with. It helps them finish better. He didn't write back. A week later, a nurse told me he'd shown the card to anyone who stepped into his room, holding it between 2 fingers like a proof. The day we signed our first annual contract, 3 neighborhoods, 90 buildings, optional workshops, a clause that said renewable like a benediction, I took the long way home. I walked past the old house. The porch light clicked on the way a habit does with no knowledge of context. I did not stop. I turned onto the block with the bakery. The bell rang when I pushed the door. "Mrs." Patel looked up, flour on her cheek like the world's kindest war paint. I held up the contract. She didn't clap or gasp. She reached under the counter and brought out a tiny bottle of cheap sparkling wine and 3 paper cups. "For what is beginning," she said, pouring careful thirds, "and for what was thrown away and chose to rise." We toasted with our elbows touching. Javier read the renewal clause again like it might evaporate if not witnessed. The bell rang and customers came and went, the way life insists, unchanged by the fact that mine had tilted toward a future. That night in my room, I pulled the pushpin from the tally sheet and replaced it with a new printout. Second turn, Q1 metrics. Beneath the numbers, I taped a photo Evan had sent of the 4th floor landing with his bins installed and labeled in handwriting he had practiced. In the corner, he'd scribbled "System works." I stood back and let the wall tell me a story. A boy, a bin, a city, a company with a name that fit. A woman who had been called trash building a life that refused the definition and made something useful from the word. I lay down and listened to the radiator clear its throat. The maple's leaves brushed the window like a polite knock. Somewhere, a train sent its long, forgiving note across the dark. I wasn't gold yet. That wasn't the point. Gold is rare and lonely. What I was becoming could be built room by room, block by block, turn by second turn. And in the morning, there would be routes and hands, and the quiet, good work of carrying what people thought they were finished with into something they could be proud to keep. The message came on a Sunday afternoon when the bakery was closed and the city had the decency to be quiet. A knock at the glass downstairs, then the widow's careful steps on the stairs, then her voice through my door. "There's someone here for you, dear. 2 someones." I knew the shape of them before I saw them, the way an old injury announces rain. My mother stood in the hallway holding a purse that had learned to carry more worry than cash. Aaron hovered half a step behind her, phone in hand like a talisman. They dressed in their better clothes, the ones that pretend occasions can be fixed by collars. My mother's lipstick was the shade she wore to weddings and arguments. "Rebecca," she said, making my name polite, unfamiliar. "Do you have a minute?" Minutes had been the only currency I could afford for years. I let them in. The room looked smaller with the 3 of us in it, the bed too neat, the desk too honest about its thrift store origins, the maple at the window taking up the role of witness. Aaron surveyed the space in a quick sweep and couldn't land. My mother looked for a chair that would make her feel dignified and found none, so she sat on the edge of the bed and perched like a person in a waiting room. "We didn't want to call," she began, which meant we did not know what to say into a phone that now reaches you. "There's been trouble." Her lipstick settled into the cracks the way truth does when it has waited too long. Aaron cleared his throat, surgeon-like. "The house," he said. "The mortgage adjustment didn't adjust. The rate reset. There were some fees." He said fees as if the word itself charged interest. "And Dad's hospital bills. Insurance is fighting the claim from the first night because of some form he didn't." He stopped, maybe because the sentence had too much pride and paperwork in it to be spoken in a room this small. My mother touched the strap of her purse, a habit she'd developed in place of prayer. "We could lose it," she said. "The house." She said house like a person might say spine. There are 1,000 ways a daughter can answer. I heard them all line up in my mouth and chose none of the quick ones. I poured water into 3 mismatched glasses and passed them out like we were going to negotiate peace. "Have you talked to the counselor at the community center?" I asked. "They can run the numbers, look at hardship programs, help you apply for a forbearance. There's a utility assistance wait list, but it moves. The city has a home repair grant if the roof is the issue. It won't fix the mortgage, but it can keep something else from breaking." "We need money," Aaron said, blunt in the way of men who have only ever been handed solutions, not asked to build them. "Short term, to keep the bank from accelerating the—" He caught himself and switched to a word he thought I would understand. "To stop the auction." He looked at my hands, perhaps expecting them to produce a checkbook or a wand. I folded them in my lap and considered the math of mercy. Cash is fast and tidy, and sometimes it's the right answer. But money in a house where the foundation is denial can turn into a second mortgage on your soul. "How much?" I asked, because love is specific before it is anything else. He named a number that was not astronomical but was not casual either. It was the kind of number that used to be impossible for me, and now lived within reaching distance if I stretched and rearranged and asked my own life to wait. My mother looked at me not directly but through the wall toward a dining room I could picture perfectly. The heavy table, the cabinet with the chipped glass pane, the chair that squeaks. "We know," she said, "that we haven't been kind." Kind was the word she chose. I respected her for not trying for fair or right. "But your father, he's not himself these days. He sits in that chair and just folds, and I am tired." She swallowed. "We're asking for help." The room was very quiet. Outside, the maples sketched shadows across my floor, as if taking dictation. I thought of hospital machines doing their measurable kindness, the hum of them, the way they ask nothing of the patient but breath. I thought of the day I'd begun second turn, and how the idea had seemed both too big and exactly the size of me. I thought of the word trash and the way it had curled in my chest like smoke, and I thought of a sentence Professor Ellis had offered like a piece of bread. "There is what you owe, and there is what you can pay." "I will help," I said. Aaron exhaled like a man at a finish line. My mother's grip on her purse loosened, and for a second I saw the girl she once was, the one who loved a boy who could fix Saturdays with a hammer. But not the way you think. Their eyes narrowed in unison. Family is a choreography even when it doesn't look like dancing. "I'll cover a month," I said, naming a smaller number that still asked me to feel it. "Enough to stop the auction clock while the counselor works the problem. I'll go with you to the bank. I'll sit at the table when the woman from collections calls so no one lies to anyone. I will help you build a plan, but I won't become your plan." My mother's cheeks went a color that meant humiliation had arrived dressed as indignation. "We are your parents," she said, and in her voice was all the old furniture. "We raised you, You fed me," I said gently, "and sometimes you didn't, both are true." I kept my eyes on hers and not on the place memory wanted me to look. "If I give you more than this, I'll be paying interest on it for the rest of my life. You taught me about interest." Aaron shifted. "So you can," he said, "but you won't." It wasn't a question. It was an indictment softened by being accurate. "I can," I said, "and I am, but it will be help with boundaries. Because love without boundaries turns into control, and I have learned the shapes of both." We sat with that for a long minute. The radiator clicked. Somewhere downstairs, a bottle rolled across tile and stopped. Aaron's phone buzzed, and he silenced it like a teenager in church. "Rebecca," my mother said finally, voice smaller, older. We said things that cannot be unsaid." She took a breath that was maybe her first honest one in months. "You were never trash." The sentence came out like a person lifting a heavy thing and discovering it can be moved. I nodded. "Trash doesn't shine," I said, not cruelly. "But gold does." I did not add "and I am shining" because you don't say that to people who are squinting. You let the light find their eyes at a pace they can stand. We made a list. I wrote down phone numbers. I texted the counselor's name to Aaron's device and watched it appear on my own screen like an echo I could keep. We blocked out Tuesday for the bank. I printed a budget worksheet and left the income lines blank because I didn't know what pride would allow them to write. When they stood to go, my mother reached for me and stopped like a person who has remembered that permission is part of touch. I stepped into her and gave the hug I could give. Brief, whole, not a contract. After the door closed, I sat with my back against it and let the wall hold me up. Relief and grief share a spine. I felt both walk through me. When my breathing evened, I called Mrs. Pytel and told her I'd be late in the morning. "Family?" she asked, that one word expanding and contracting to fit the situation. "Family," I confirmed. "Then you'll be on time," she said. "This is the dough." At the bank, fluorescent lights made everyone look a little guilty. We waited while a manager typed with the deliberateness of a man who has lost and found his job more than once. I translated his sentences into human where needed, and my mother listened with her hands in her lap like a student who wants to pass. Aaron asked questions with a calm that was not entirely borrowed. We left with a forbearance plan, 3 follow-up dates, and a list of papers to unearth from drawers that had eaten better things. In the parking lot, my father sat in the passenger seat of the car like a man caught between getting in and getting out. His face had a new fragility that doesn't show up overnight even if it seems to. When he saw me, he did not do the thing I feared he would, pretend we were fine. He lifted his hand a few inches off his knee, palm open, a gesture that could be hello or surrender. It was enough. I stepped to the window and we looked at each other the way people look at old photographs, choosing which parts to remember. "We'll try," he said, voice gravelly from disuse. "We'll do what they said." He nodded toward the bank as if it were a person. Then quieter, "You came." "I did," I said. It was both record and promise. Work did not pause for our reconciliation. Second turn had routes to run, metrics to meet, raccoons to outthink. The city approved our year 2 proposal with a signature that looked like a mountain range. Javier high-fived me hard enough to make my palm remember it. Evan texted a photo of his buildings landing with a handwritten sign. "No contamination." We're better than that. I forwarded it to our team chat with a string of emojis I pretend not to use. At night, I set aside the envelope with the month's help and the receipt from the bank, and I wrote myself a line I wanted to believe forever. You can be generous without going broke. It applied to money, yes, but also to time, to patience, to forgiveness. Especially to forgiveness. A week later, my mother came into the bakery early, before the rush, before she could be seen doing it. She bought 1 loaf and then waited until the bell had stopped ringing to speak. "You looked happy," she said, picking the word as if it might be spoiled. "On that poster." She nodded toward the taped-up profile. "You looked like a person who is herself." "I am," I said. It felt like telling the truth to a doctor who can't treat you unless you give the real symptoms. She pressed the change into the tip jar with a furtiveness that made me want to love her, and then she left without adding anything that might ruin the sentence she just managed. Back upstairs, the maple flickered sunlight across my wall, contract, metrics, blueprint, postcard. The tally had become less about pounds and more about proof. I stood there and let it talk to me, about what returns and what doesn't, about the economy of repair, about a house that might be saved and a girl who already had been. There is a way a life turns when you stop being the thing someone called you and start being the thing you are. It doesn't snap. It swivels, like a door on a hinge finally oiled. Part of me waited for a final test, a dramatic moment when I'd need to choose between rescue and relapse. It didn't arrive in a single scene. It arrived like everything else had accumulated, choice by choice. Help, not surrender. Love, not debt. Boundaries, not borders. That night, I walked past the old house. The porch light clicked on because timers don't learn. I did not slow. Somewhere farther on, a street lamp buzzed itself awake, and I stepped into its circle like a person crossing a small, lit bridge. The city kept moving, as cities do, but I had finally learned how to move with it instead of against it. Second turn grew into something that could stand without my shoulder braced against it every hour. Routes ran. Neighbors sorted. Kids carried scraps down the stairs like treasures. What once had been survival now looked like work with meaning, and work with meaning looks a lot like living. My parents kept to their plan. The house did not disappear. I visited sometimes, not as the daughter desperate for approval, but as a woman with her own keys, her own table, her own name that no longer trembled when spoken. My mother listened more than she used to. My father nodded more than he talked. Aaron came once to see the warehouse and left quieter than he arrived, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. We weren't healed in the way movies promise, but we were stitched enough to sit in the same room without tearing. And I, Rebecca Hayes, the daughter once told she was nothing but trash, stood in the light of a life I had built turn by turn, piece by piece. Trash had not destroyed me. It had been the soil, and I had been the seed. Gold is not what I became. Gold is rare, cold, often hoarded. What I became was something warmer, steady, useful, alive, and mine. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If any part of it has reminded you of your own strength or made you feel less alone, then these words have done their job. I wish you health. I wish you peace. And above all, I wish you a family, by blood or by choice, that reminds you every day you are enough. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel so you and I can share more journeys like this together. Take care of yourself and take care of each other.